Our next contestant is Monte. The title of his speech is Stories, Truth or Fiction? Truth or Fiction, Monte.
I've got my notes to help me keep going in case I have a problem. I'd like to introduce myself briefly. I was born in Sioux City, Iowa, where I was raised until I graduated from college, at which point I won the military draft lottery and entered into the military service, which I continued for 27 plus years until I retired as a sergeant major in 2003. Now, Sergeant Major, for those of you who don't know, is the highest enlisted rank. Enlisted. Remember this will come up later. So what I want to talk to you today about is kids, not just kids, but stories. Have you ever faced a classroom full of kids? I teach primary, and we've got 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and these kids can be wild through anything. They can be wild through songs, they can be wild through a movie, they can't be distracted at all. And it's my theory that the naughtiness of the child is in inverse proportion to their ecclesiastical aspirations of the parents. That is, the worse the child. So imagine you have a child that's naughty enough that his father could dare hope for the first presidency. But if you give him a story, the whole class suddenly quiets down. So stories are very important. They're important to your family. I'm sure you've been at family reunions where all the stories come out, the embarrassing ones from your past, all the time. And my wife has a lovely family, but her mother was a very proud person. She was, her last name before she was married was Oakleberry, and in spite of the fact that they lived in Goshen, Utah, she thought that, her family was up there. They had important historical pioneers that came over and were part of Utah history. And her husband, Boyd Ainge, a fine gentleman, a hard worker, a good family man, but unfortunately his family was way beneath the Oakleberries in Lucille's imagination. So my wife and I, I've heard this tale now, my wife and I got ourselves an Ancestry.com subscription for the overseas stuff. And she looked up the shift that the Ainges had come on, hoping to find their name on the roster. And she's scanning the names and scanning the names and scanning the names. And she comes across the Oakleberries. These high and mighty folk had ridden on the same ship that the lowly Ainges came over. And it didn't say whether they were in the stateroom, in the staterooms, or if they're in the steerage on this list. So we don't know whether it's truth or fiction, but all of a sudden we've got a glimpse of the truth. That maybe the Oakleberries of Goshen, Utah, maybe not quite so high and mighty as they let themselves on to be. My father was in the Marine Corps in the Second World War, and he told war stories. Now, do you know the difference between a fairy tale and a war story? A fairy tale starts out, once upon a time. And a war story starts out, so there I was. I'm saying that there's no difference. One of my favorite stories that my dad told me, he was on Guadalcanal. And one of my favorite stories was where he was encountered what seemed to be a high-ranking person. And he asked him to go for a Jeep ride with him. Now, at this time, nobody saluted, nobody wore rank, because that was just inviting enemy fire. So they were driving around, and he figured he was fairly important because people were glad to see him. And the roads on Guadalcanal were just one lane, and mostly mud. And so if you came to somebody going the other way, one of them had to back up till it came to a little place we could turn out. So they came together, and the other guy stands up and he says, "Back up." My dad's guy stands up, "No, you back up." "No, you back up, you back up." And the other guy stands up and says, "You back up, I'm a captain in the United States Army." The other guy, my dad's guy, stands up and says, "You back up, I'm a major in the United States Marine Corps." "Yes, sir, I'm backing, I'm backing, I'm backing." Dad says later, says, "You know, sir, I don't mean any disrespect, but are you sure you're a major?" He says, "Damn right, Sergeant Major." My family goes back a long ways. The Civil War, my great-grandfather, Simon Kessler, was in the Illinois Infantry, and they marched all across the South, sometimes hearing the sound of battle for the entire war, and a few little skirmishes, but not enough to even get a single battle streamer for their flag. But nonetheless, he was also a veteran, and he and his wife, whose maiden name was Nancy Caulfield, they moved to the Iowa area, and they had a son, and his name was Uncle Bob. And the story of Uncle Bob was my favorite as a child. Uncle Bob's mother, Nancy, was proud to say that all her children, all her boys, were science. Now, by science, Nancy meant that they were both professionally trained as wrestlers, and they were professionally trained as boxers as well. And she insisted that all her boys learn how to cut hair. So if you can take care of yourself physically, and if you're a barber, well, then you can always take care of yourself. So Uncle Bob asked my grandfather, whose name also was Monte, to go with him to Lusk, Wyoming, where he wanted to homestead. So they got to Lusk, Wyoming, and they pulled into the local saloon, and they ordered up a couple of beers. And pretty soon, a couple of the locals came alongside, and they took my grandfather's beer. He was kind of a shy man, so he kind of didn't do anything. And then another one on the other side took Uncle Bob's beer. Well, Uncle Bob took it back. The guy took Uncle Bob's beer. Uncle Bob took it back. Pretty soon, the guy took the beer and wouldn't give it back. Uncle Bob says, "Monty, get under the table. There's going to be trouble." Well, my grandfather was nothing loath, so he did dive under the table. And Uncle Bob cleared out the place in about 30 seconds. Science, it's a great thing. So the people were impressed, and they brought the local champion in to fight with Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob says, "Monty, take all your money and put it on us." The local champion was covered with hair, and he was about 7 feet tall in the story. And they met on top of a butte there in Mesa. They met on a mesa in Lusk. And the fight starts, and it's a terrible fight. There's just arms and legs everywhere. And Uncle Bob's head pops up from underneath. He says, "Monty, I think I'll carry him for a few rounds so the folks can get their money's worth." And so then they go back to fighting. And pretty soon Uncle Bob's head pops up, and he says, "Should I take him now, Monty?" He says, "Yes," because he's got all his money on him. Uncle Bob whips a scissors lock around his wrist, breaks 7 ribs, and the local champion is done. So I had always kind of admired this story about Uncle Bob, but I wondered whether it was true or not. And I looked up his ancestry too, and I found Uncle Bob in the various censuses, and his profession was always listed as a barber. So Uncle Bob, I know you existed. Now, whether he ever fought the local champion, I can't tell, but I love the story. Thank you.